grow heavy and still. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to remember, nothing to do at all. Just a story, softly told, to carry you into sleep. Tonight, we travel back, more than 500 years, to a small island at the very edge of the world, ringed by endless ocean, where great stone figures stand watch over the sea. This is the Hush Historian. Close your eyes, if you would like. I will take it from here. On the slopes of an old volcano, in the grey light before the sun, the great stone giants waited, half born from the rock that made them. Some stood finished and watchful. Others lay still half carved in the hillside, faces emerging slowly from the stone, waiting for the hands that would free them. The island had been shaping these figures for longer than anyone living could remember, and it was not yet finished with them. In a small cluster of low thatched houses near the coast, Manu woke before the others did, as he did most mornings. It was the hour when the world still belonged to darkness, when even the seabirds had not yet begun their calling from the cliffs. He lay still a moment, listening to the quiet breathing of his family beside him, to the faint and endless sound of the waves folding against the shore. His tools lay where he had left them the night before, a heavy stone adze, worn smooth by his grip, and the smaller picks he used for the finer work. Manu was a carver, as his father had been, and his father before him. The shaping of the great stone figures was the work of his hands and the work of his life, and he had never once imagined himself doing anything else. He rose quietly and stepped out into the cool morning, and began the walk he had walked 10,000 times, along the familiar path across the open grassland toward the quarry. The island stretched wide and dim around him, the sky vast overhead, the sea a pale line at every edge. He was a small figure in a large and lonely place, and he had long ago made his peace with that. The quarry opened before him as the light grew, the great inner slope where the stone giants were born. Everywhere around him lay the enormous figures in every stage of their making, some barely begun, some nearly finished, lying on their backs in the rock as though sleeping, waiting to be raised. It was a place of patient, unhurried labor, and Manu loved it the way a man loves the thing he understands best. He stopped before the figure he had been shaping these past months, its face still half buried in the stone, one side smooth and formed, the other still rough rock. He rested his hand against it, the way he always did before beginning, feeling the cool stone that would, in time and with patience, become a face that would watch over the living long after his own hands were gone. Below him the island was beginning to wake, the green slopes catching the first light, the tall palms of the forest standing dark against the brightening sky. It was a good land, this island, generous in its way, giving stone for the figures and wood for the boats and shade beneath its trees. Manu had never known any other place, and had never needed to. The world, for him, ended at the water, and that had always been enough. By the time the sun had cleared the horizon, the village had begun to stir. Thin smoke rose from the morning fires, and the low thatched houses came alive with the small sounds of a community waking, the scrape of a bowl, a child's early voice, the soft talk of people beginning another ordinary day at the edge of the sea. Hina was already at work near the earth oven when Manu returned, preparing the morning meal with the unhurried ease of long habit. She looked up as he came, and did not ask where he had been, because after so many years she already knew, the same path, the same stone, the same quiet walk before the day fully began. She simply nodded him toward the food. The meal was simple, as it always was, roots from the garden, a little fish from the day before, laid out on a woven mat beside the coiled net. It was not a rich table, but it was a full one, and Manu had learned long ago that fullness mattered more than variety. He ate slowly, in the growing warmth of the morning, content with the small and certain comforts of the day. His son Nuku was already awake and restless, running along the coastal path toward the sea the way boys do, chasing nothing in particular, delighted by the morning. He was 9 years old enough now to begin learning the carving, young enough still to treat the whole island as a thing made for his play. Manu watched him go with the quiet fondness of a father who remembers being that young himself. Down at the shore, the fishing canoes lay drawn up on the rocks, waiting for the men who would take them out past the reef into the wide and restless ocean. The sea gave much to the island, fish and travel and the endless sound that filled every night, but it gave nothing easily, and the people had learned to meet it with respect. Beyond the reef, the water stretched away to the edge of the sky, unbroken, without another shore in sight. When the meal was finished, Manu called to Nuku, and the two of them set off together toward the quarry, the boy trotting to keep up with his father's longer stride. It had become their morning habit, this walk, the father and the son, and Manu used the time as his own father had used it with him, pointing out small things, teaching without seeming to teach, passing down a way of seeing the world one quiet morning at a time. Their path took them past the edge of the forest, where the tall palms rose thick and green, alive with the small movements of birds. The trees had always been there, as constant as the stone and the sea, giving their wood and their shade and their fruit, and Manu passed them each morning without a second thought, the way a man passes anything he has never once had reason to imagine losing. The quarry was full of life by mid-morning, dozens of carvers scattered across the great stone hillside, each bent over a figure in some stage of its slow becoming. The sound of stone striking stone filled the air from every direction, a patient rhythm that had not changed, Manu supposed, in longer than anyone could say. He found his place among them and set Nuka down nearby, where the boy could watch and learn. Manu lifted his adze and began, the familiar weight of it settling into his grip the way it always did, and struck the first blow of the day against the stone. It was slow work, and required a kind of patience that could not be rushed or forced, only given, hour after hour, day after day, until the shape hidden inside the rock revealed itself to those willing to wait for it. Chips of stone flew with each strike, and slowly, so slowly it could hardly be seen happening, the curve of a cheek began to emerge where before there had only been rough rock. Nuka watched closely, the way he always did, his eyes following his father's hands, learning without yet knowing he was learning, the way children absorb the shape of their parents' lives simply by being near them. Elsewhere in the quarry, a team of men and women worked to move a finished figure down toward the coast, hauling it slowly across the land on rollers of palm wood, rope strained taut, voices calling rhythm to one another. It was work that took the whole village, in its turn, and Manu had done his share of the hauling in years past, before his hands had turned fully to the carving. Down along the shore, other figures already stood finished, a long watchful row facing inland over the low houses of the village, their backs to the endless sea. They had stood there, some of them, since before Manu was born, and would likely stand long after he was gone, and there was a comfort in that, in belonging to something that reached backward and forward so much further than a single life. Nearby lay a great red stone topknot, carved separately from a different quarry across the island, waiting to be raised atop its figure's head. Manu paused a moment to run his hand over its surface, admiring the work of whoever had shaped it, feeling the quiet kinship that existed between all those who gave their lives to this same slow, patient craft. He straightened at last and looked up at the great figure he had helped raise some years before, its face calm and settled above him, and felt the particular smallness a person feels standing beneath something built to outlast them. It did not trouble him. He had made his peace with smallness long ago. It was, he had come to believe, simply the correct way to feel beside a thing like this. From the high ground of the quarry, the whole island opened out below him, the scattered village, the coast lined with its patient watchers, the pockets of forest still standing green against the volcanic slopes, all of it ringed by the vast unbroken sea. It was, Manu thought, as he thought most days he paused to look at it, a good and sufficient world, complete in itself, needing nothing beyond its own shores. His father Rengi had told him, more than once, that the island had once worn its forest more fully still, the palms thicker and taller across slopes that were now more open than Manu had ever known them. Manu had heard the telling so many times it had become almost like a story rather than a memory, a thing that had happened to the land before his own eyes had opened to it. Rengi sat now where he often sat, on a worn stone near the edge of the village, looking out over the island he had watched change across the whole long span of his life. He carried the island's memory the way the quarry carried its stone, patiently, without complaint, offering it up to whoever came close enough to listen. Manu crouched beside Nuku and pressed a small carving stone into the boy's hands, closing his son's fingers around it the way his own father had once closed his fingers around a tool much like it. It was a small motion, and an old one, repeated now for as many generations as anyone could count, the quiet handing forward of a life's work from one pair of hands to the next. Beyond the quarry, where the land dipped toward the coast, a grove of tall palms still stood thick and generous, their high fronds catching the sun in a way that scattered warm light down through the canopy. It was a beautiful stand of trees, old and unhurried, and Manu passed beneath it often, glad of its shade, though he had never given much thought to what it might mean for such a grove to one day not be there. Teams of villagers worked at the grove's edge that same afternoon, felling a number of the great trees and hauling their long trunks away toward the quarry, where they would serve as rollers to move another finished figure to the coast. It was necessary work, done as it had always been done, and no one paused to count how many trees remained standing against how many had already been taken. Where a palm had stood that morning, there was now only a raw pale stump amid scattered wood chips, the cleared ground already looking a little wider than it had the day before. It was a small thing, one tree among many, and Manu, passing it on his way home, gave it no more thought than he gave any other ordinary sight of an ordinary working day. He paused near the standing figures that evening and let his eyes travel, out of some habit he could not quite name, toward the slope above the quarry, where the forest sat a little further back than he remembered it sitting in his own boyhood. He did not draw any conclusion from the noticing. It was simply a thing he saw, and then did not see again, the way the mind lets pass what it is not yet ready to understand. The island wore the full weight of midday now, sun pouring down over slopes that were, here and there, more open than they had once been, wide stretches of grass where a denser stand of trees might once have stood. The great figures kept their watch along the coast regardless, unmoved by whatever slow changes moved across the land behind them. In the village, the ordinary business of midday continued in its familiar shapes, Hina and the other women moving between the low houses with the easy rhythm of long practice, children underfoot, food set out to dry in the sun. It was, on its surface, a day exactly like every other day the island had offered for as long as anyone could remember. Rengi called Nuku to sit beside him for a while, as he often did, and spoke to the boy in the low, unhurried voice he used for the things he most wanted remembered, telling him again of the island as it had been, trusting that some part of the telling would take root, even if the boy did not yet understand why an old man spoke so often of trees. Nuku listened, turning a small carved wooden bird over in his fingers as he did, a toy his grandfather had made him long ago from a scrap of palm wood, and though his attention wandered the way a child's attention does, something of his grandfather's words settled into him regardless, waiting for a day when he would understand them fully. Manu found himself, in the quiet hour before evening, looking again toward the bare grassy rise above the quarry, and this time the noticing lingered a little longer than it had before. There was nothing wrong, exactly, in what he saw. Only a kind of thinning, a spaciousness where there had once been density, the sort of change too slow for any single day to reveal. Along the coast, the great figures held their patient watch as the afternoon light began to soften, the wide sea stretching unbroken behind them, a single seabird crossing the pale sky above. Nothing about the scene had changed in any way a stranger might have noticed. It looked, as it always looked, like a world that had simply always been this way. And yet, seen from a height, seen all at once the way only a patient eye could see it, the island wore its beauty a little differently now than it once had, the forest a little thinner, the grass a little wider, the great stone watchers standing guard over a land that was changing so slowly beneath them that no single life could ever quite catch it in the act. It was Rengi who first said the word aloud, one evening as the light faded over the quarry, though he did not say it as an accusation or a warning, only as an old man's plain observation offered to whoever cared to hear it. "Fewer," he said, looking toward the slope above them. "There are fewer trees now than there were when I was a boy your age, Manu." He did not say it with alarm. He said it the way a person remarks on the changing color of the sky, a fact noted and then set gently aside. Manu turned the words over in the days that followed, and found that once spoken, they could not easily be unheard. He began to notice, in the ordinary course of his days, small things he had somehow managed not to notice before. A stretch of hillside that had always seemed, in his memory, to hold more shade than it now held. A gap between stands of palm that felt wider than it should. He did not know if these noticings were new, or if he was only now, for the first time, allowing himself to see what had been true for a long while. He asked his father about it directly one evening, sitting beside him on the worn stone at the village's edge, and Rengi answered slowly, the way he answered most things, drawing the memory up from somewhere deep and well-tended. When I was a child, Rengi said, the forest came nearly to the shore in places where it does not reach today. We took wood then and thought nothing of the taking, the way you think nothing of drawing water from a spring. It did not occur to us that a spring could run dry. Manu asked whether it troubled him, this change he had watched unfold across his life. Rengi considered the question with the same unhurried care he gave to everything. It troubles me less than you might expect, he said finally. A man does not mourn a slow thing the way he mourns a sudden one. The forest did not vanish in a single terrible day that a person could point to and grieve. It only grew, year by year, a little thinner, until one day an old man looked up and found himself surprised by how much had gone without his noticing. There was a wisdom in this that Manu did not fully grasp until much later in his own life, the understanding that the largest losses are often the quietest ones, the ones that never announce themselves with any single dramatic moment, only accumulate, patiently, in the small gaps between one ordinary day and the next. He sat with his father a while longer in the softening light, and said nothing more about it that evening, though the thought had settled into him now, the way his father's words always eventually settled, and would not entirely leave. In the weeks that followed, Manu found himself watching the felling of trees with an attention he had never given it before. He watched the villagers select a palm for the day's rollers, watched the careful work of bringing it down, watched the log dragged away toward the quarry to serve its brief and necessary purpose. It was work as old as the island's memory, and he did not know how to think about it as anything other than what it had always been, ordinary and needed. And yet he found himself, more than once, counting the trees that remained standing against some private and unspoken measure, a tally he could not have explained to anyone, least of all himself. The evening gatherings, when the village came together to share food and talk as the light failed, began to carry a new thread of conversation that had not been there before, or had been there quietly for a long while and was only now being spoken aloud. The canoe builders spoke of the difficulty in finding trunks long and straight enough for the great seafaring vessels their grandfathers had built with ease. The house builders spoke of walking further than they once had to find suitable timber. No one spoke of alarm. They spoke, instead, the way people speak of a familiar difficulty, one more thing to be worked around, the way the island had always required its people to work around the particular difficulties of living so far from any other shore. Manu listened to these conversations more closely than he once would have, remembering his father's words, and found himself understanding, slowly, that what Rengi had described as a single slow forgetting was in fact happening in 100 small ways across the whole life of the island at once, each one unremarkable on its own, each one part of the same larger and quieter unraveling. It was in the season of the long rains that the great palm fell, the oldest tree that anyone in the village could name with certainty, a giant that had stood at the edge of the forest since before even Rengi's earliest memories. It had not been felled for any particular purpose. It simply came down in a night of hard wind, and the village woke to find it lying across the clearing, its vast roots spread bare to the sky. There was no ceremony for its falling, no formal mourning, and yet the whole village came to look at it in the days after, drawn by something none of them quite named. Manu stood among them, looking at the great trunk, and felt a weight settle into his chest that he had not expected, a grief out of proportion, it seemed, to the simple falling of a single tree. But it was not simple, he understood, standing there. It was the falling of the last of something, the visible ending of a slow process that had been invisible until this single, undeniable morning. Rengi came and stood beside him, leaning on his stick, and looked at the fallen giant for a long while without speaking. "It was here before my grandfather's grandfather," the old man said at last. "And now it is not." Manu asked what should be done with it. Rengi considered this the way he considered everything. "Use it well," he said. "That is all any of us can do with what the island still gives us. Use it well, and do not pretend the giving will go on forever simply because it always has. Manu returned often, in the weeks after the great tree fell, to stand at the edge of the clearing where it had stood, and found himself turning over a private grief he did not fully understand and did not try very hard to explain to anyone else. It was not, he told himself, the loss of a single tree that troubled him. It was something larger and less nameable, a sense that the island he had known as a boy was quietly becoming a different island, one tree, one gap, one slow year at a time, without any single moment he could point to and say, "Here, this is where it changed." He thought of the moai he carved, the great figures meant to stand for all the ages that would ever come after him, and felt for the first time a strange and unfamiliar doubt. He had always believed, without examining the belief very closely, that the island beneath those figures would remain as constant as the stone itself, that the world his statues watched over would go on being recognizably the same world forever. Now he was no longer certain that this was true, and the uncertainty sat uneasily beside a craft built entirely on the assumption of permanence. He did not stop his work. There was no version of his life that did not include the carving, and no other way he knew to spend his days. But he carried the new uncertainty with him into the quarry each morning, a quiet companion to the old familiar rhythm of adze against stone, and found, in time, that a person could hold both the work and the worry together, the way a person holds any two things that do not resolve into a single simple feeling. The years that followed moved the way years always move, quickly in the remembering and slowly in the living, and the island continued its patient thinning beneath the daily business of ordinary life. Nuku grew from a boy trailing his father to a young man carving his own figures, his hands finding the same rhythms Manu's hands had found a generation before, the same patience, the same slow attention to the shape hidden inside the rock. The forest continued its long retreat, not vanishing all at once but simply, year by year, standing a little further back, leaving a little more open grass where shade had once fallen. The great stone figures went on being raised along the coast, though Manu noticed, in the practical way of a man who had spent his life close to the work, that the moving of them grew harder each year, that timber for rollers had to be sought further afield, that the easy abundance of his boyhood had become, without any dramatic turning point, a thing that now required real effort and real care to secure. By the time Nuku had a son of his own, the island wore a different face than the one Manu remembered from his own youth, more open, more grass, the standing forest reduced to smaller stands here and there, precious now in a way trees had never needed to be precious before. Nuku's boy grew up in this newer island without ever knowing the older one, the way each generation grows up believing the world it is born into to be simply the world, unaware of what came before it, unaware of what has already been quietly lost. Manu found, in his own advancing years, that he did not resent this. The boy was happy, and the island still gave what it could give, and there was no use in mourning to a child a forest he had never seen and could not miss. Manu told him stories sometimes, the way Rengi had once told stories to him, of an island a little fuller, a little greener, and watched the boy listen with the same half-attention he himself had once given his own grandfather's telling, and understood that this too was simply the pattern of things, memory passed forward, thinning with each generation the way the forest itself had thinned, until one day it would exist only as a story with no one left who remembered it as anything more. His own hands had grown slower with age, though they had lost none of their old patience, and he still went to the quarry most mornings, working now on a single great figure that he suspected, without quite saying so to anyone, he might not live to see finished. It did not trouble him particularly. He had watched other carvers before him leave figures unfinished in the stone, waiting for hands that would come after to complete what they had begun, and he had always found something fitting in that, the craft outlasting any single life that served it. He worked on the figure slowly through those later years, chip by patient chip, and found in the working the same steadiness he had always found there, whatever else changed around him. The island continued to change. The forest continued its long retreat. But the stone remained the stone, patient and unhurried, willing to be shaped by whatever hands came to it, in whatever age those hands arrived. In the last years of his life, Manu took to sitting where his father Rengi had once sat, on the same worn stone at the village's edge, looking out over an island that had changed so many times across his own long life that he had stopped trying to hold every version of it in his mind at once. The great stone figures still stood along the coast, patient as ever, watching over a village and a people who continued, as people do, to live their ordinary days regardless of what the land around them was quietly becoming. He thought, in those last unhurried years, less about the forest and more about the figure he had left unfinished in the quarry, its face still half buried in the rock, waiting for hands he would never know to finish what he had begun. He found a peace in the waiting itself, the same peace his father had spoken of so long ago, the understanding that a life's meaning did not depend on seeing every beginning through to its ending, only on beginning well, and passing the rest forward with care. He died as he had lived, unremarkably, surrounded by the family his hands had helped shape as surely as they had shaped any figure in stone, and the island went on afterward the way islands do, indifferent in its patience, continuing its long slow story with or without any single life to witness it. Centuries passed. The forest that Rengi remembered, and that Manu had watched thin across his own lifetime, continued its retreat long after the last of those who remembered its fullness were gone, until the island stood largely bare, its great trees reduced to memory and to the pollen buried in ancient soil that patient scientists would one day study, piecing together, grain by grain, the long slow story of a forest that had vanished so gradually no single generation ever witnessed its full disappearance. The great stone figures remained, as they always had, standing their patient watch along a coast now more exposed to wind and weather than it had ever been in Manu's time. Some had fallen. Some stood as they always had. And in the quarry, still half buried in the volcanic rock exactly as it had been left, one great unfinished face still waited, its work interrupted by a hand that had simply, one ordinary day, stopped moving, leaving the rest to whoever might one day come to finish it, or simply to wonder, staring up at that unfinished stone face, what story of patience and slow change it might have told, had anyone thought to ask it while there was still time. Nobody now remembers the name of the man who began that unfinished figure, nor the name of the boy who once ran along the shore, nor the old man who sat on a worn stone and told his memories to a grandson who only half listened. Their names, like so many names from that island's long story, were never written down anywhere that survived. But the figures they raised still stand, watching over a changed and quieter island, and the unfinished face in the quarry still waits, patient as stone, for a story it never got the chance to finish telling. Sleep well. This is the Hush Historian, and I will be here, softly, whenever you need me again.